As powerlifters, we get in this sport for a reason, and that's because we want to lift some heavy weight. And a trend in modern day powerlifting is the incorporation of these yearly heavy singles. And it's used a bit different than it used to be. We talk about the maximal effort method from Conjugate and Louis Simmons, where they're truly going to an all-out max single on a training day. But within I would say more modern programming, we're seeing the incorporation of heavy singles, possibly on all three lifts on a weekly basis, in that 6 to 8 RPE range, or the 86 to 92% range. Something that's heavy, but not truly maximal effort. And the application of that varies. Some people are doing it more year-round. Some people are doing it more in strategic times based off of competition and testing. And within this video, I really want to cover all aspects of it, because while I think this topic is very much talked about, I don't know if I've seen an all-encompassing guide to talk about every aspect of the application and introduction of heavy training singles within programming. And in particular, I'd say this video is a bit more biased towards newer lifters, as it's a common question I get asked, and I see other coaches getting asked, is what's your thought on having singles year round? Because I think a lot of times when people get into powerlifting, they see this through Instagram and the use of these heavy singles. And like I said, we get into powerlifting to do that. We want to lift some heavy weights, and that's a very appealing method, not only in the sense of being able to lift heavy weights, but also the enjoyment of training. And I think a lot of newer lifters immediately kind of gravitate towards that. But also within that, this is biased towards coaches, as a lot of my videos are, is the understanding of how we can probably best apply this, not just kind of have a blanketed statement that we do heavy singles year round and everyone should do that, but how should we apply this to the majority of lifters in the sense of the spectrum we see, and be able to individualize the application of these singles to best suit a lifter's needs. And to give a little background into my implementation of singles, is I used to do them a lot more frequently, and sometimes very much year round. Actually, this dates back to probably 6 or 7 years ago, before I would say even they were mainstream and popular outside of the maximal effort method. I'm saying more in the terms of modern day application. I read some article on post-activation potentiation and was like, oh, I see this application of why don't we do a heavy single prior to the rest of our work. And while I'm going to get into that and the aspect of post-activation potentiation, while I don't think that's necessarily the best application is the sense of a heavy single, that's where I kind of bias towards. Is I would do these heavy singles year round. And then that became very popular, not because of me by any means, but that became a very popular method. We saw Mike Teixeira doing that very frequently. We saw Joey Flex doing that very frequently. And many of these coaches still do that very much to this day with a lot of success. Myself, I've tended to bias away from thinking of doing heavy singles year-round on most lifts. And probably the longer I've coached, the less I implement those frequently and implement them instead more strategically. But within that, that's really based on the lifter. I definitely have lifters on some lifts doing yearly singles and doing it year-round. And I actually have some lifters on some lifts never even doing a single until meet day. They never even touch a single in training. So there's a big spectrum of the application, and that's where I really hope this video can kind of help to guide people into the understanding of what is this application of. Not everyone should just be doing singles year-round. Not everyone should never do a single. There's this big spectrum in between, and we need to know kind of how the application is going to best suit each individual lifter. So within this video, I'm going to get into the pros and cons of implementing heavy singles. I'm going to get into the whys of how they're beneficial. And we've got a guest presenter in Zach Robinson from Data Driven Strength, who's going to be able to break down some of the whys for us in a manner that I don't think I could really get into as much detail in. And then also going through kind of the downsides and the cons of implementing heavy singles and what kind of the drawbacks are, why we may or may not want to input them either yearly or even within any training program, as well as the drawbacks of implementing heavy singles and kind of why they aren't the end-all be-all to everyone should be doing them all the time. From that, I'll get into who and who not to program them for in a sense of a yearly basis. I think for the vast majority, most people are going to have them in their training program at some point, and I'll get to some caveats of where I may not use them at all. But for the most part, everyone's going to do them in some manner. So I'm going to kind of bias towards who or who not should be doing them more on maybe a yearly basis or more frequently, where we're doing them more than just outside of kind of competition prep, but throughout our annual training plan. And then I'll get in the application of heavy singles with each lift, because that's a big caveat, is the application to squat, bench, and deadlift and how they differ between all three lifts. And then lastly, if you watch a lot of my videos, you know I love doing this because I want to give some real examples as we're going to get into kind of the when and how to program. And I'm going to break down when we're looking at the benefits and the downsides, I'm going to break down all the application of this and how I might be programming it within individual lifters programs, so you can kind of see how that is played out in the actual athlete individualization. So to kick it off, let's get into the why and or the benefits of implementing heavy singles. And just as a precursor to that, I want to give a little bit more background of what is a heavy single, just in case someone's watching this that might not have as much kind of insight into what I mean by that. So a very common method in training and programming is to have some type of heavy single, usually a 1x1, at like a 6 to 8 RPE, which is leaving anywhere between 4 to 2 reps left in the tank. It's something that we can usually do on any given day, and also it's going to be in some form submaximal. It's not a maximal lift like the max effort method of something like Westside or Conjugate. It's able to be used prior to what we consider kind of the bulk of the working sets, whether it's rep work or whatever we may be doing afterwards. But in some manner, we're using those, and a very common technique is people will do those year-round, and there's reasons to do them year-round and or throughout meet prep and sprinkled in wherever strategically they best fit. So the first main reason, and arguably the most important thing in all of sports, whether it's powerlifting or any sport in general, is skill practice. If you want to get better at something, you need to do it. If you want to get better at throwing a baseball, you need to throw a baseball. If you want to get better at throwing a baseball accurate in a live scenario in a game, you need to replicate that as much as possible. And the same thing goes for powerlifting is a couple times a year, we step onto a platform and we do a 1RM with our squat, bench, and our deadlift. Within our training, we obviously do that at some points in training, but the disproportionate level of fatigue and kind of wear and tear that accumulates of doing that too often isn't typically worth it. So we do things such as heavy singles in the manner of like a 6 to 8 RPE with some reps left in the tank at a more submaximal load to be able to replicate that skill as closely as possible. You'll probably see some people who are just not as good at the skill. They might start doing things different once they get to that kind of heavier weight. They might start tempoing the rep. They might start dive bombing it. They might start losing their bracing. They might start doing a different pattern. You'll see that a lot of times where people get to these heavier weights, they start actually adjusting their technique, their form, and even their mindset and kind of psychology going into it. And we'll get to that in a little bit with some other points as well. Next up is heavy singles are a great auto-regulation tool. The fact of the matter is the further away we get in the specificity realm away from our 1 rep max, the harder it is to actually rate things in the sense of RPE. It's much easier to rate a single at an 8 RPE and know what that should feel like and what that is than doing a set of 8 at a 6 RPE. It's just going to be harder and there's going to be more subjectivity to it. So when we are trying to be as accurate as possible in auto-regulating our training, a heavy single can be a great tool to be able to do that, whether it's auto-regulating in the sense of the daily workout, whether it's auto-regulating for the week, whether it's getting into the next point, which is testing, to be able to establish some new training max or some type of estimated 1RM based off of it. But in either way, it's a great tool for auto-regulation. And so leading directly in the next point, it's a great testing tool. And it doesn't mean we need to test by YOLOing our lift and going to a 10 RPE and then going a full out max. Like I mentioned, the closer, as long as we're decently close in that specificity range to that 1RM, we're going to be pretty good at being able to kind of subjectively rate kind of the difficulty. So if we're doing a single at a 7 to 8 RPE, we can be able to use some calculations to be able to then gauge what our estimated 1RM is and get a better idea of kind of where our top end strength is. So we can be able to use that within blocks, whether that's at strategic times or year-round. That's something we're going to talk about year-round singles is something that we can use that as a yearly gauge to be able to see how the majority of our training is working and translating to our 1 rep max strength. If we're doing sets of 8 and we're like, you know what, I'm getting really good at those, but I don't know necessarily if that's actually translating to my top end strength. Well, if you're having a single in there as well sometime within the week, you can be able to directly test that and be able to see kind of the strength progress from there. Another benefit of heavy singles, and I kind of already alluded to this a bit, is just more confidence at heavy weights. This goes along with the skill practice aspect, but there are definitely some people that get more anxious, more fearful, more nervous in the sense of approaching these heavier weights where they start to change things just because of the anxiety of it. And I'm going to get into later with programming for someone like that, how we might be able to manipulate things a little bit to be able to overcome that a bit more. But one of the things they're going to need to do is they're going to need to just lift heavy weights. You're not going to overcome some type of fear or anxiety unless you do that specific act. So if someone is having issues with confidence when it comes to heavier weights, they just need to be able to experiencing that more often in some type of manner to be able to gain confidence in that and be able to replicate that on a weekly, daily, and block-to-block basis. One thing I mentioned earlier was post-activation potentiation. I'm going to touch on that, and while I don't necessarily think I would be using heavy singles for post-activation potentiation. It is something that's talked about, and I want to kind of allude to why it is talked about and how that could possibly translate, but why I believe it doesn't really translate. So what is post-activation potentiation? Kind of a non-formal scientific answer of kind of what is going on when we're doing high force production movements. That could be a 1 rep max, that could be a box jump, something where we're using maximal force. It doesn't necessarily mean the load on the bar, it just means maximal force. Is that we are recruiting maximal motor units. We only recruit as much as we need to do a certain task, and where we're using maximal force production, we're recruiting the most motor units. A great way to be able to show post-activation potentiation for people who are not familiar with it is if you know baseball. A lot of times you'll see baseball players put that donut on their bat, they'll swing it and it's heavier, and then they take it off and now the bat feels lighter. That's post-activation potentiation at its most basic level. So the thought could be within powerlifting, if I do this heavy single, that's not like truly like a true 1 rep max, but like that 6 to 8 RPE range, and I do that prior to the rest of my work, well, that might potentiate the ability to then be stronger on the preceding sets because of that post-activation potentiation. While I think that is a possible explanation, the issue in practice comes down to the fact that a heavy single on a squat, bench, or deadlift, especially bench or especially squat or deadlift, is disproportionately fatiguing, and probably any benefit of post-activation potentiation you see is taken away by that fatigue. And what you actually see more in athletics when they use PAP or post-activation potentiation is something like a box jump or a plyo push-up or some type of explosive movement that's not fatiguing that then leads into the actual training or whatever they're trying to do. Within powerlifting, I know there's some studies that have tried to kind of somewhat replicate that. I've actually tried that with some people, like the box jump aspect. I don't know if it's specific enough, and I haven't really seen much transfer to it, but that would be the more direct transfer we're looking for, where you're maximizing motor recruitment, but you're not in some way fatiguing in the body by actually having to lift a maximal weight. So that's my personal opinion on why it doesn't necessarily translate super well. I think maybe an argument can be a little bit better for bench press, since bench press is a little bit less disproportionately fatiguing in the sense of doing a heavier single. But either way, I've done it and tried to see if that was an actual application. I just haven't really come to the conclusion that it is. So the next two benefits of heavy singles are probably a little less important, but they're honestly something that I want to point out because they are a factor within training. The first one being as a reward. As I mentioned in the first sentence of this video, as powerlifters, we get into the sport to lift heavy weight. And a lot of times, if you're going too long without kind of satisfying that desire for some people, they're going to start to lose enjoyment or lose motivation or have some type of monotony or boredom within training. And it's something where sometimes I'm going to add that in there because I can just tell it's kind of time that someone is wanting to test things a little bit. Even if we don't need it for the actual training stress and stimulus we're trying to do, it might be in there as a reward for a lifter to really keep them engaged and give them an idea of kind of where they're at. Because sometimes if we're doing less specific work, they're going to kind of be wondering, okay, where's my strength at? How is this translating? And either one, I need to see that, or two, even if I know maybe it's translating well, the lifter might need to kind of some reaffirmation and some confidence in it. So even though I would say it's less important, it's definitely a reason that needs to be kind of thought of is using those as a reward at times if you're not using them on like a yearly basis and year round. And now the next reason is definitely less important. And honestly, this is a con of heavy singles, and I'm going to get to this as well. But I want to say there is a slight little benefit, and I want to explain why. And this is kind of maybe get a little flack for this one. But there's reasons in some manner sometimes. I don't really have any athletes I necessarily try to do this for, but I understand that there are some people that kind of may need this, is these heavy singles for Instagram clout and marketing. Now, that's actually the bane of my existence when it comes to these heavy singles. And one of the big reasons why I don't like them is this emotional tie and this need to feel like you need to do something special to post it on Instagram to get reposted by King of the Lifts. There's a ton of issues with that. But there is a very small market of lifters who make their living off of Instagram. And in some way, they need content to be able to drive traffic to their page. And this is not a reason to be YOLOing lifts and be doing heavy singles year round, but it might be a reason that they're going to do them a little bit more often. And again, I'm not saying I ever program for this reason, ever. I'm just saying that I think it's a valid reason that some people might do them a little bit more frequently because they know they need that content for their Instagram. And as long as they're doing it in a manner that is productive for their training, where they're actually staying in the pocket, they're not just using these as YOLO lifts to get reposted to the king of lists, but they're using it to actually help their training, whether it's skill practice, testing, auto regulation, and the other things we're going to get to in just a second here. And they're not just using it just simply for clout. That's a good thing. They can be a beneficial tool that they're able to get motivation from it because they're getting, one, they're getting the business traffic they need from Instagram, but two, they might be getting a little bit of self-validation from that. And there might be some increased motivation that as they get the self-validation, it kind of increases the motivation. So like I said, that's a sticky one, and there's probably more cons than to a pro, but I actually wanted to bring it up because that's probably something most people I don't think would admit, that there is actual potential benefits if a lifter is relying on Instagram for business potential, of that lifter maybe doing more heavy singles year round, to be able to have that kind of content as long as it is productive in their long-term training plan. And then lastly, something I skipped around of the benefits is the actual physiological, neurological, and morphological benefits of singles. I've talked more about the actual practice and programming of them and possibly the psychology of them in the sense of confidence building. I've skipped over the other stuff because while I could talk about that, there's some guys I know from Data Driven Strength with Zach, Josh, and Jake who are extremely knowledgeable, and they're actually getting their masters down at FAU and working the muscle lab or powerlifting lab with Mike Zordos, and this is what they do. They know that this is their forte and something that they can explain much better. So Zach was gracious enough to be able to put together this next piece for you, really explaining the physiological, neurological, and morphological effects of heavy singles. So let's roll over into that.
What's up, guys? As Steve said or will say in this video, there are a ton of practical reasons one may include heavy top sets within a training program. However, there is also some solid physiological rationale to suggest that heavy top sets may be a good idea for most. We can break these down into three primary categories: skill adaptations, morphological adaptations, and neurological adaptations. To be very clear, this is already a gross oversimplification, as all of these areas are integrated in practice and can't be easily separated from one another. That being said, I think it provides a useful framework for the discussion in order to go into a bit more detail for each one. Starting with skill adaptations, I think this is probably the area that most of us are familiar with. Ultimately, the skill of strength we are training for on the platform is maximal force production expressed in a specific context. In this case, the squat, bench press, and deadlift. Now, heavy singles or top sets in training will come very close to mimicking the demands on the platform, and this is evidenced by what's called the force-velocity relationship. Very simply, when a single repetition moves slowly, despite maximal effort to move it as quickly as possible, this indicates a high amount of force is being produced. Because we just said that high force production is the name of the game for powerlifting performance, we're providing an opportunity to consistently practice against these demands. Very likely, this comes along with more confidence due to increased familiarity of the task, which can improve performance in its own right. Additionally, as we are consistently exposing ourselves to these demands over time, there are physiological reasons to believe we become more efficient at doing so. An example of this is a decrease in what's called antagonist co-activation following training. Very simply, let's take the squat for example. Following training, there may be a decrease in hamstring activation that's used to stabilize the joint in order to more efficiently let the quads do their job extending the knee. Now, before we talk about the next two areas, it's important to mention one caveat about the current research we have in this area. To my knowledge, we don't have a ton of evidence examining the differences between high load, say 80 to 85% of 1RM, and very high load training, above 90% of 1RM. Thus, the last 2 points we talk about should be taken conceptually and with a grain of salt. In terms of morphological adaptations, there are two primary ones we can discuss. First is an increase in what's called tendon stiffness. By increasing the stiffness of the tendon that connects the muscle to bone, we can increase the efficiency at which force is transmitted across it. Similarly, it's been discussed in the research that an increase in what's called lateral force transmission may also play a role in increasing the efficiency of force production. This is potentially done by increasing the connections between the muscle fiber and the tendons via connected tissue, once again increasing the amount of force transmitted to the tendon and ultimately moving our bones. Neurologically, there may be some reasons to think that heavy top sets may improve strength as well. Specifically, increases in things like rate coding, which is the speed at which we can recruit a group of muscle fibers that are called a motor unit, or an increase in fiber conduction velocity, which is the speed at which a muscle fiber can take that signal from its parent motor unit and turn it into a contraction, both seem to improve with trained individuals. This may benefit velocity-specific rate of force development, ultimately allowing a lifter to reach peak levels of force production quickly enough to surpass the sticking point before they fatigue. All in all, there are a ton of speculative reasons we could come up with to include heavy singles or top sets, but in my opinion, the evidence, both practical and physiological, is strong enough to at least give them an honest shot in your own training from which you can make your own conclusion. Finally, thanks again for Steve allowing me to come on the channel. Back to you, man.
So thank you, Zach, for that. That was greatly appreciated, and hopefully you all got something out of that. The one thing I want to kind of bring around with that is the fact of the matter is like he kind of mentioned this. He didn't use necessarily the word sometimes of just heavy single. He said heavy top set. And that's why when I'm going to get into some of the application here is that we don't need just a heavy single to accomplish these tasks of these physiological, neurological, and morphological adaptations. I mean, a single at a 7 is the same weight as a double at an 8. Like we're using similar intensities. So that's why a single year round isn't always needed. And that's where we're going to get into kind of when possibly we use that and when we don't. Because really, anytime you're using these heavier intensities, we're also not only satisfying those aspects, we're also satisfying the other. If you're doing a double at an 8, that's still decent skill practice. That's still a decent auto-regulation tool. That can build confidence in heavier weights. There's these things kind of all, it's usually we aren't just doing a single or a top set or whatever it may be for just one reason. It usually has a primary reason, and then all of the reasons overlap together in some manner or the other. And so now that we've covered kind of the benefits and the whys of programming heavy singles, whether that's on a block-to-block basis or we're doing it year-round, let's get into kind of the downsides of it now. So probably the single biggest downside, in my opinion, of heavy singles and why I've kind of gotten away from them using them more year-round and being more selective and strategic when I do it, is that lifters tend to put too much focus on them. And literally their entire week revolves around that single. And there's a couple issues with that. Is one, most likely that single is a very small piece of the puzzle in their total training. While there is an intensity benefit, and we talked about kind of the benefits it can have when it comes to the actual adaptations that occur, if you're doing one single and then you've got 4 sets of 5 afterwards, the total training volume of that single is minuscule in comparison to the totality of not only that training session, but also the week. Yet way too often people put all of their eggs in that basket on the single, and then they sandbag the rest of their work because they don't think that's near as important as doing the super heavy weight. And even with that too, what usually comes in hand with that same type of thought process is, especially like high adrenaline type lifters who get really amped up for that top set, is they do that heavy top set and or single, and then they blow their entire like adrenaline and motivation into that single. And then we see a huge adrenaline dump afterwards, and work that they should be able to do significantly higher weights on, they're all of a sudden struggling with because they have this emotional drop off of intensity and motivation and adrenaline from putting everything into that single, when again, that single was a very small piece of the puzzle. And if that becomes a consistent issue, we're wasting a lot of our training allocation to a one rep that in the grand scheme is not that important in the realm of doing that year round. And going hand in hand with that is people have a more emotional tie to the weight on the bar when they're doing a single at an 8 RPE, because that is very near what their goals are in the sense of beating their 1RM, and it very well could even be PR weight at an 8 RPE. But you have an emotional tie to it. And when you have an emotional tie, there's things that come along with that. Either one, like I said, putting too much focus on it, or two, overshooting. You have these numbers in your head that you feel like you have to hit because you know, okay, my PR is 400 pounds and I want to hit, I think I can hit 425, so that means I have to do 390 at an 8 RPE, or else I can't hit 425. And then you go do it at 390, and it ends up being a 9 or a 9.5, because guess what? You can't do 425 on that day, but you have this emotional tie of what you feel like you want to do. And that's why there's this big propensity to overshoot, as well as obviously, like I've already mentioned, the IG clout. There can be a slight benefit to that, but more often than not, people are overshooting because it's going to get them more attention. It's going to possibly get them a King of the Lifts shout out, and they're doing this not so much to benefit their training, but more to benefit their own ego and desires and satisfaction. Instead, if we're rotating through different rep schemes and variations, we're going to have a lot less emotional tie to what is that top end strength. Like if I told you right now off the top of your head, tell me what your 4 rep max pause squat is. You might know that, but you might have to dig for it. And that's kind of a good thing because you don't have this emotional tie to knowing exactly what should be on the bar. You're probably going to make more objective decisions versus making emotional decisions then when actually completing that training, because you don't have this direct tie of knowing exactly what you should do or think you need to do this to do X amount of weight for your supposed 1 rep max. You more are going to take what actually the day is giving you. And tying in with the emotional aspect as well, I just see way more often that if a heavy single doesn't go as a lifter expects, it tends to affect them mentally a lot more than if some other rep scheme or variation does the same thing. Because again, there's a very strong emotional tie to the exact weight on the bar. And I'll have someone hit like a single at like a 7 RPE and they'll be like, well, I hit the same weight before and it's actually easier. And they immediately think, oh, I got weaker. This is terrible. Training's not working. And that's not the case by any means. We're going to have ups and downs, and we're going to have slight little downticks in training based off fatigue and based on where we are in the time of the year and based off of the training block as a whole and the goal of it. And so we're going to see a lot of ups and downs when it comes to that 1 RM strength on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. And while we're going to ride these waves, the goal is these waves eventually lead to an increase. But on a daily or like a weekly basis, we might not see that. So people tend to have this really strong emotional tie. And there's definitely lifters who literally, they hit a single, it doesn't go how they want. They think they got weaker and they literally go off the deep end. They think everything's wrong and I need to change everything. And I just don't see that with other variations of top sets. It's a very strong correlation to people who do heavy singles. And it's usually someone who does heavy singles more year round versus strategically when we are meaning to actually maximize the strength of those singles versus other times where we're just having them in just to have them in. But it could be the opposite too in the sense of the emotional spectrum, where some people tend to overshoot and they put too much emphasis on it. As I mentioned, there's some people who have lack of confidence in these heavier weights. And there's some people when they see this single on their program, they literally have this anxiety and fear throughout the entire week leading up to it. And while, like I said, we need to be able to overcome that and do it, there are some people that just tend to have a higher level of anxiety with heavier weights, no matter what you do, no matter how much confidence you build. And if you're always telling them every single week you have to do that, a lot of times it's going to take away from the rest of the work, not because they're overly focusing in a way of wanting to push too much on that single. It's that they're overly focusing on the fear and kind of not wanting to do it. Like they're worrying too much about how that's going to go. And those are the people that have the propensity to undershoot and go the opposite way. So we can go both ends when it comes to kind of that emotional tie in regards to heavy singles. And a lot of times when we see these heavy singles, I'm just using the Instagram stereotype. It's usually younger lifters and they're progressing on them really well, which is awesome. But that's going to stop. You're eventually not going to continue to get these linear progressions on your singles. And what's most likely going to happen once you get to that intermediate and advanced stage is you're going to be repeating the same weights fairly often. You're going to be doing the same weights over and over and over and over. And then 3 or 4 months down the road, I'm doing 5 pounds more at the same RPE over and over and over and over. And what I can tell you is once you get to that stage, a lot of people start to really lose motivation from that. People don't like to see the same weight on the bar over and over. And that's where if we cycle through rep ranges and variations and different things like that, it can take away that emotional tie to the singular weight that you expect and be able to rotate things a little bit more. And the things I mentioned already are a bit more like in the mental aspect and the approach and how we program it. Something a bit more on kind of the actual how it affects the body is for a lot of people, singles are a bit more disproportionately fatiguing based off compared to their benefit. Because obviously, yes, we are the skill practice of hitting this heavy single, this force production, this motor unit recruitment, all the things that Zach talked about, very important, but there's other ways we can accomplish that too. And a single can be very disproportionately fatiguing and take away from us being able to do a lot of other stuff that might be more beneficial in the grand scheme of things. And that's going to vary lifter to lifter. Some lifters aren't going to get nearly as fatigued. That's also going to vary lift to lift. I'm going to get to it in a little bit, but bench is probably going to be less proportionately fatiguing than a squat or a deadlift is going to be doing a heavy single. So it's just about finding what's right for the individual and what can be able to be productive and enhance their training versus being a hindrance. And then something I've kind of already talked about a little bit is that if all we do is singles, and that's all we do year round, it tends to limit our testing parameter and what we're actually using as our gauge to one singular thing. And while that can be beneficial at times, and we need that single because that's truly the main test of what we're doing, if that's the goal every block is to hit or is to test our 1RM single at a certain RPE or percentage, it tends to sometimes become demotivating. Because as I mentioned, if you're not a brand new lifter experiencing these newbie gains, that's a lot of times going to be a pretty similar weight over and over. So again, I've just found over time, as I've gotten more experience, that there are definitely some lifters that I'm going to do singles more year round with, and there's definitely some lifters that I'm going to rotate that out with different rep schemes, with different goals in the block, with different variations, to be able to rotate these in the block testing parameter goals. Because they're going to be like, if we're only hitting, you can kind of use the conjugate method. Like sometimes in conjugate, in a very good way, they might have 3 to 4 squat variations they rotate through, and they max on a weekly basis. So once a month, and since every 4 weeks, they repeat the actual variation, and they tend to probably hit a PR on it. If they did it every week, they might not be seeing that, but if they rotated every 4 weeks, they very well each time might see a little bit of a PR. And the same thing goes for powerlifting. I'm just gonna use a very basic model, but let's say we just rotate in a 4-block structure of 4 rep max, 3 rep max, 2 rep max, 1 rep max, and we just rotate through that over and over and over and over. You're probably going to, each time you come back, be able to hit a new rep max at each one of those because you're allowing enough time between those testings of that specific goal to be able to see the adaptation overload and strength increase between that. So next up, I want to talk about who and who not to program singles for more frequently. There's zero argument that as powerlifters, we're probably going to have to do some type of heavier single work. It's just based on the factors that I'm going to mention, it's going to determine the frequency of that. And so when we're discussing, should we do these year round or should we do these at very strategic times or certain blocks or closer to meet, a lot of that's going to come down to how much do you fit, in my opinion, to one of these groups. When I talk about who should be doing it, if I have X amount of factors there, how many of these, if you satisfy more of those, probably you're more likely going to benefit from doing year-round singles. If you're in the opposite group, where there's a lot of factors that I mentioned on who should not be doing singles more frequently, and you're checking off those over and over and over, you're probably someone we're going to do it less frequently with, if even in some circumstances, not at all. So getting into who are probably going to benefit from more frequent heavy singles, one of the single biggest factors, and I'm leading with this for a reason, is calmer lifters. Calmer lifters who don't tend to get really high adrenaline for a top set and then they have this adrenaline dump. People who just kind of come in a calm manner, they hit all their sets, they tend to be able to complete those at similar intensities, they don't have some type of massive drop off. There's someone who tends to really benefit from more frequent singles because it doesn't tend to be as much of a hindrance within their training where it's taking away from the other work. They can just have that as part of their training and then all of the other work follows suit just as normal and just like if you hadn't have had that single to begin with. Next up is lifters who enjoy the process versus just the result. Now, we should all enjoy the result. We're not powerlifting to not get stronger, but there's a difference, and it could probably be a whole video on this, of people who enjoy the result versus people who enjoy the process. And people who enjoy the process tend to be people that have greater longevity in the sport. They tend to have more enjoyment in training because they can separate themselves from just the performance of a single day or a single meet or anything like that and just enjoy the process of getting there in the first place. And because of that, they tend to have less emotional tie to day-to-day performance or week-to-week performance or block-to-block performance. They just enjoy the process as a whole. So if they see some fluctuations and dips, they aren't going to let that affect the rest of their training. And so again, if we're doing singles, most people are going to see some ups and downs with those. And so if you're just focused on the result, you're probably going to struggle with that. But if you enjoy the process, you're probably going to have an easier time adapting and not letting those fluctuations kind of get into your head. And those same kind of lifters too are ones going to go with the next point, is lifters who can do a good job of allowing those singles just to be an auto-regulation tool and not letting the result of that single actually determine their thought of the workout. Because again, if we're just using it as an auto-regulation tool, we are 100% okay with ups and downs because that's the whole point of it, because we want to auto-regulate down and we want to auto-regulate up. Too often people think auto-regulation is just a way to increase weight. It's also a reason to decrease weight. So there might be a single we do and we actually see decreased performance. We're like, okay, that's actually really good data. I need to pull back a little bit. Let's come down a bit with the rest of our work for the week. Awesome. Great way to use it for auto-regulation, but the lifter has to be okay with that and be able to mentally handle that auto-regulation aspect. And usually they're also the ones that tend to enjoy the process as well. When it comes to the technical side of things, lifters who have less breakdown at heavy weights are tending to be able to do singles more often. If you're experiencing significant breakdown anytime you get past a certain intensity, Usually what you need to do is work below that intensity and gradually increase that floor so that to make sure that you can be able to maintain position and technique at heavier weights. And so while to an extent doing that heavy weights is going to benefit that, if you're experiencing significantly great form breakdown, it's probably something where we need to work on that outside of doing heavy singles and then work our way back to it. But like I was kind of saying there's kind of like a happy medium there. Is like if you're having technical breakdown at heavier weights, we also need to do heavier weights for the skill practice of it. But maybe let's say like you're constantly breaking down at like 92%, which is about an 8 RPE single. But at 6 RPE, about 86%, you're doing really well. And the skill practice is really beneficial for you. That might be someone who actually really needs a lot of singles, but we need it at a certain intensity, and then we need to slowly increase the baseline of that intensity until we can then carry over that technique into those heavier singles at like 92% and 8 RPE. And lastly, with the technical side, this is a little bit more rare, but there are some people who experience technique regression very, very easy if they get away from certain intensities and or variations, like someone who really just needs high comp specificity with low bar squatting. And if you do too much safety bar or high bar, they really start to regress on the low bar technique. The same thing kind of goes with intensities, is you'll have some people that their top end strength is X amount, but if you aren't consistently near that amount, they're going to regress a ton when you come back to it. They're going to really have to work their way back up. So those kind of lifters, you might there's definitely a couple of people I coach that I'm leaving singles in pretty much year round and sometimes fairly easy singles. But if I don't, we end up having to have this big build up back to certain intensities because they just have a lot of technical breakdown and regression from not doing those intensities in a long time. In the volume to intensity spectrum, there are definitely lifters who tend to handle volume very well and then get really beat up from intensity. And there's some lifters who handle intensity very well and get really beat up by volume. And that might be lift dependent as well. Well, if a lifter is really good at handling intensity and gets really beat up by volume, there's someone who might benefit more from singles practice on a more frequent basis because it's not as disproportionately fatiguing. As I said, a downside of it is it can be more disproportionately fatiguing, but for some lifters it isn't. And so for them, it might be a better training tool on a more frequent basis because it doesn't disrupt the rest of the training program. And then touching on the last couple of points, these kind of come back to reasons of why and the benefits of heavy singles, and leading back to the people that are going to need them is I already mentioned, one of the big reasons to do singles is to build confidence. So if someone is needing to build that confidence at heavier loads, they're probably going to need to do them more frequently. If we're just going to avoid them altogether, every time we come back, it's going to be a consistent issue of fear and anxiety and probably some breakdown once we get to that. So we need to kind of overcome that fear. So they might need some more frequent exposure that maybe once they get over, we don't have to do it as frequently, but it's just kind of something we have to see. At least in the meantime, to get past that anxiety, we need to be able to kind of have more exposure to those weights to be able to overcome that. And then lastly, on who to program these for is obviously as we get closer to competition, there's a very, very strong possibility for the vast majority of people, we're going to be doing some type of singles work and loading that up to decently heavy weight for the skill practice and for the testing aspect of leading into the meet, as well as the physiological, neurological, and morphological adaptations that are occurring from being able to actually handle those heavier loads. With that too, we also are going to use it sometimes in a testing way, and it depends on the person of how frequently we're testing. That's why I think a lot of times we see some newer lifters tend to do decently well with more frequent singles exposure because they need to test more often because we are going to probably have an idea that they are going to be able to beat past 1RM strength more frequently. Versus if you have a very, very advanced lifter who it might be 6 months before we're going to see any type of noticeable increase to their 1RM, we don't need to test that every single time. Now, there might be other reasons to use the singles within that type of person's program, but at least in the testing parameter, we don't need to use those as frequent if we know that there's not going to be some type of dramatic difference in a block-to-block basis, where with a newer lifter, we might be seeing that. So that might be a reason for a newer lifter to do more singles more frequently, to have a bit more of test to be able to re-gauge strength and training maxes. So now going to the opposite end of the spectrum, we'll talk about who not to program singles for as frequently, which a lot of this is just going to be the opposite. If I talk about one thing on who to program it for, it's probably going to be the polar opposite in who to not program it for. And leading off, it's those super high adrenaline based lifters. Someone who is going to just go all out on that top set, and then they're going to have this adrenaline dump afterwards. And while that might be something something that needs to be addressed and fixed and kind of honed in a little bit more and just using that adrenaline at certain times, it still tends to be a personality characteristic I see. And there's other ways I actually talked about in one of my videos of talking about using psychology in the sense of programming. I kind of talked about how we can kind of cater towards these lifters. But those are the kind of lifters that I'm probably not going to do singles year round with, because they're going to put way too much focus into it. They're going to have way too much of an emotional tie to it. And it's going to tend to be a detriment to their training. And a lot of times, those high adrenaline lifters, but not always, that also correlates to possibly a higher level of neuroticism. And the neurotic lifters are going to have a more emotional tie to the weight on the bar, and they're going to have a bit more of an emotional reaction with those dips in strength and those waves that we see. So there's someone that I'm probably not going to program singles as much for, because I want to limit that emotional reaction to those ups and downs, and that emotional tie to the weight on the bar for just singles, when we have other options that can accomplish the same task, if not in a better way. And as I've talked about on the pros and cons, is that the Instagram clout can kind of go both ways, but usually it's going on the con side the vast majority of the time. And there's lifters that way too often they're using those singles as a way to just kind of get some Instagram clout, get attention, get reposted, get recognition from their friends. And you know what? Like I said, there could be possible benefits to that, but most of the time it's not, because those people are tending to make that 7 RPE single a 9 or a 10, and it's a week 1. They're abusing those singles. They're abusing it for the Instagram recognition. And for those people, if that's beginning to continue to be an issue, they're probably someone that needs to do singles less frequently. And those are the kind of lifters, along with kind of the neurotic aspect and the high adrenaline, that tend to overly focus. And I've kind of already mentioned that in the other points as well, is that if a lifter is just overly focusing on that single, their entire week is around, what am I doing on that single? And they literally are just skipping over and kind of sandbagging everything else they're doing, not putting the same focus and attention to it. And then everything's that single, and that's literally like 1% of their training for the week. That's someone that I'm gonna try and program singles less frequently for as well. So now getting over the more technique and kind of adaptation and physiological side, is I'm going to program singles less for people who possibly have a history of injuries at higher intensity. It could be a rabbit hole of getting down injuries and kind of what happens and the possibilities of why injuries happen. But there tends to be people that sometimes have injuries that are kind of volume correlated. They're just doing too much workload. Or there are some people that have injuries that tend to be correlated with intensity, just weight on the bar. And as they reach a certain threshold, they tend to increase the risk for injury because of kind of the overloading aspect of what that intensity is doing. So for those type of people, we're probably going to do that less often. I actually have, this is an example, I have some lifters who kind of fit in this category, who are never going to do a single until the day of the meet. We very well may work up to like a double at an 8 RPE, which is like, we could do a single at a 7, but they tend to do better by doing like a double at an 8 RPE or a triple at a 7, something that's going to be within that range, so we can establish an opener range. But we stay away from those heavier singles until meet day, because it tends to just be overly risky in the sense of kind of their injury past. And there's people as well, they don't have a risk of injury, but those singles are very disproportionately fatiguing. And I'm going to use some examples a little bit later, but like an example is I had a guy who's a big dude, 242-pound lifter. He was a very strong lifter, and those were very disproportionately fatiguing for him. Whenever we did them, we would have to pretty much, that would be the top set, and we have to really back off from there, because it would really just, not just because he was a high adrenaline lifter, it would just really disproportionately fatigue him. So we had to be very careful about the introduction to singles, especially on squat and deadlift, because it would create an effect where it would have a great hindrance to the rest of his training. And then the last one I'll touch on for who not to program singles for as frequently is something I already kind of talked about on who to program singles more frequently, which is where this one's a little like hard to be able to fully describe. Is like some people who shouldn't do it more often is people who experience a lot of technical breakdown at that heavier weight. And like I said, it's kind of a 2-for-1, is that those people also need to experience that weight, but also need to stay away from it. And it's kind of hard to explain that. I probably would say, like, let's say you have a new lifter who's very new to the sport and has a lot of technical inefficiencies that you need to fix. They're probably someone that we're not going to do singles with. Versus someone that's been doing this for a while, and they just tend to have a little bit of form breakdown at heavier weights, but they've been lifting for a while. They have decent technique. It's not something that's necessarily like, you could maybe even go, not even fix it, and you can be completely fine. Like, it's one of those things where you're trying to find that like extra 5% of improving technique. That's kind of the difference of what I'm talking about there. Is it when you're pretty technically sound, but there's some breakdown at heavier weights, you might need more practice with it. But when You even have breakdown at lighter weights because you're so technically inefficient and so new to this that you probably shouldn't be doing singles then. So that's probably the good description of kind of being able to differentiate between who should and who should not based off of technique breakdown. So we talk about the people of who or who not to program singles more frequently for, but even within that, a big thing that needs to be taken into consideration, and maybe even one of the biggest things, is the application for each lift, because the application for squat, bench, and deadlift is very different because each of those lifts, the application of singles can vary differently in kind of how they are used, how they are benefit, and the proportionate level of fatigue and risk they carry with them based on the exercise you're doing. So I'll start with bench because that's the lift that I still very often program singles year round for. And there's multiple reasons for that. Is one, you're just using less weight. You're going through less range of motion. You're going through less weight. It tends to be less proportionally fatiguing and a little bit less of a risk. Like there isn't near. I mean, I don't want to say doing a heavy single increases injury risk, but bench you can tend to do those more often and be able to tolerate them better. And within that too, not only talking about the things I touched on who and who not to program singles more frequently for, part of this goes along with like how efficient and how technically proficient is a lifter and how efficient is their lift. What I mean by efficient is kind of going back to range of motion and distance traveled. If you've got someone who has a very high arch bench, they're very technically proficient, they're moving through very little range of motion, they're probably going to be able to tolerate singles year round, if not multiple times a week, without really any issue. And honestly, they may need that because they'll find that they regress too much with the skill of those heavier weights if they don't keep those in. And then moving on to squat's actually the lift I probably program singles the least for. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Is one, because the proportionate fatigue that can occur from it. Two, there's just kind of the most that could go wrong with squat. In my opinion, squat's probably the most technically advanced lift of the big three. We're going through the most changes in joint angle. There's the most things having to happen. We're not only having to deal with shoulder mobility, we're having to deal with hip flexion, we're having to deal with knee flexion, we're having to deal with bracing, we're having to deal with ankle mobility, we're having to deal with foot. There's a lot that goes into a squat. And there tends to be more room for error once we get to heavier weights. And like I said, if those are things that we need to work on, we may be needing to do singles to kind of get to that. But I think we can also be able to work in different rep ranges to the same kind of to higher relative intensities and accomplish similar tasks. So for squat, I just don't think year-round singles tend to be the best option. I think there's other options that are better, as well as this is a little bit caveat to it, especially like last year. During the pandemic, a lot of people were working out at home and they didn't have spotters. Squat arguably is the most dangerous when it comes to not having spotters. Now bench can be dangerous too, but it's a little bit easier to roll that off of you. Squat, there's just kind of nowhere to go. And so what I'd have a lot of times is if I was to program those singles, people would either have a high anxiety because they don't have spotters, or two, they would just undershoot because they wouldn't even want to push to higher weights, knowing that they didn't have spotters. And that's actually like myself. I do that all the time because I usually lift at home, and I know for a fact I tend to sandbag more at home because I don't have those spotters, and it tends to be mainly on squat. On bench and deadlift, especially deadlift, that's not as much of an issue. So that's just a little caveat there with squat, depending on training environment. That might actually influence a little bit kind of the implementation and frequency of singles use. And then lastly, we have deadlift. And I kind of put that in between because deadlift can kind of go either way. Deadlift, there's definitely a lot of people that tend to actually respond to fairly low volume, high intensity deadlift training, kind of using deadlift more as like technique practice and letting squat kind of drive the volume for lower body. And that usually biases a bit more towards sumo deadlifters, since sumo and squat tend to have a bit more carryover. And so I've tended to find that my sumo pullers can handle more frequent singles year round. I think that one, because sumo is a bit more technical of a movement and they need more practice. Two, I think sumo is a bit less proportionally fatiguing than a conventional single, and that's just my opinion, but that's usually going back to joint range of motion and distance traveled. And then lastly, squat tends to carry over a little bit more into sumo than squat carries over into conventional deadlift. A good example of this is Chance Mitchell, who come meet time, I might be quoting this wrong, but he drives squat volume like crazy, and he pretty much only does singles on deadlift. I think he says something like 12 singles on deadlift in the week, and that's it. He just does that, and he just uses that for technique and using those high-end intensities, and then kind of backing off from there. But that's a good example from that. For conventional, I'm not saying I don't program singles. It's just going to depend on the person and on kind of their level of fatigue that is induced from singles, and how efficient they are with pulling. If they're someone with super short arms and a long range of motion, they're probably going to get a little bit more beat up from pulling frequent singles on deadlift, where if they're a bit more advantageous of a conventional puller, it's probably going to be a little less proportionally fatiguing for them. So like all things, it just kind of depends on the lifter, but I'd say deadlift is kind of between squat and bench. Bench, very frequently programming those year round. Squat, I personally don't program them year round very often. Deadlift, kind of in between, and kind of depends on the person. I would say that probably more often I would see that with a sumo puller, but even differentiating between sumo and conventional, I would say it depends on the level of technique work needed and how much we're just biasing towards using deadlift for technique versus how much are we using deadlift for volume. If we're biasing toward the technique end, we're probably going to do more frequent singles just to maintain that skill practice at a higher intensity. So lastly, let's get into the how to program this. So we're gonna go through a bunch of different examples to really cover all the things I've kind of talked about, to kind of show how the implementation of this kind of works out in practice. The one thing I'll say is, if you came to this video hoping for me to just to say, oh yeah, let's do yearly singles, or give you an exact amount of singles you should do a year, this is the exact amount of frequency, that's tough. That's just gonna be an individual thing. I'm trying to basically give out all of the things that need to be considered when deciding the frequency of implementing heavy singles, whether you're doing it year round, whether you're just doing it close to a meet. These are all the factors that kind of need to go into it. And the last kind of way to kind of look at that is kind of how we implement that, and you'll kind of see kind of different ways of maybe even if you do these year round, maybe there's different ways you use them on a year within the annual plan. Maybe sometimes they're more based on skill practice, maybe times they're more based on testing, maybe sometimes they're more based on auto-regulation. The actual use of them could change block to block, even if you're using them year round. So we'll really kind of go through all of the different ways we can use these and how I have these in my athletes' programs to hopefully kind of wrap up the idea of this and be able to kind of bring this concept all together for you to be able to apply to your own training. So taking a look at this. First up here, we've got skill practice. So this is a lifter who has a fairly high arch technical bench. So we're actually going to be looking at all three lifts because this is someone that we're actually doing pretty frequent singles with all three lifts. We don't do the year round except for on bench. Year round, I'm pretty much almost always doing singles on bench with him because, again, very high arch bencher, very efficient, low range of motion. He's someone that really needs the consistent singles work to keep that practice, but it's also, I mean, like a 7 RPE single to him is absolutely nothing. He could do those all day, and he could do that the day before his main bench session, he'd be good. So the actual aspect of skill practice, though, was very strategic within this block. We are about 12 weeks out from a meet, so this was really a block to set up the progression for the final 2 blocks of really just kind of getting the skill and getting acclimated to these singles, but not really going too crazy with them. So you'll see on bench, we actually have ascending sets into a top triple, followed by a 7 RPE single. Again, he's someone who's going to be able to maintain the ability to express strength through all these sets. I'm not worried about that single being all of a sudden really hard, but here's one of the big things. You're going to notice 7, 7, 7, 7. For the most part, he's going to pretty much hit the same weight every week. And he might go up and down. He might hit 160 on week 1. He might hit 157 on week 2. He might hit 162.5 on week 3. He might hit 162.5 on week 4. This is a lifter that I had no issue programming this for the skill practice aspect and literally repeating the same intensity every week because it wasn't the point of trying to test or drive intensity. The entire point was to be able to practice, and that practice might go up or down. And you can actually see he has a 7 RPE single on his Monday bench, and he has a 7 RPE single on his Friday bench. It's literally the same RPE. He actually has 2 singles on his Friday. It's the same RPE every single time. It is not meant to be anything but skill practice at this weight so that in the coming blocks, when we want to drive the intensity of it, he's going to be ready for it. He's going to have been doing over 3 singles at a 7 RPE weekly, and it's going to be very easy to jump into the higher intensity singles and start driving closer to kind of a 1 RM. We're also doing something similar on squat. He's someone who gets a lot of benefit from singles on squat in the sense of skill practice, and he tends to regress quickly on it if we don't have them in. So same exact thing. This is building up to the future blocks. Is it's a 7 RPE single every week after his ascended top set, just to be able to start to feel those weights of kind of, let's say, like a little bit below opener range, so that coming in the next block, he's going to be very ready to ramp that up. And then lastly, same thing on sumo. So this is a very high skill practice singles block, in the sense of, like, if there was a block I could write that was the definition of skill practice for singles, this would be it. I couldn't get any more specific than this. So we're getting the singles in the same manner on deadlift. We're at 7 RPE each week. The only difference is we might drive intensity up on deadlift a little bit more by week 3 to test a little bit more. We'll kind of see. It's just kind of based on how things are going and how he's feeling, but this is a really good example of the most stereotypical way to program skill practice singles versus programming them. I mean, this isn't auto-regulating anything. It's not testing anything. We're simply just getting the skill practice in so that when we want to ramp up intensity, he's ready for it. Next up, we've got testing. So I'm not even going to necessarily show you the program here. I'm more going to show you what's going on at this 1RM chart. So we've got 2 blocks here from this lifter. This first block is from his last meet prep, 2 blocks out. So not the main block leading in the meet, but 2 blocks out. This one is from, actually I take that back. This is the most current one of him leading in his meet right now, 2 blocks out. This is from his last meet prep about 6 months ago. And so I'm not really gonna, like, the program's already filled out. We obviously did some singles elsewhere, but what I really want you to see here is using those singles to establish estimated 1 RMs to be able to then get data of trending estimations of where his strength is. So you can see here on squat, we can see based off of these numbers, and then based off of the estimated 1 RM, how we were tracking. We can see that on bench press, how he was tracking, and we can see that on deadlift, how he was tracking. So this was used as a way to be able to establish an estimated 1 RM. And then what we can do is use this past block to now look at the future block and kind of get an idea. These actually, because this lifter is very good at rating RPE, and his RPEs tend to, like his estimated 1 RMs, actually really translate well to what he can do on the platform. This lifter usually gets about 5 kilos more on deadlift, and he did. He hit 240, and he was 234 here. On bench, he tends to be a touch lower. He established 127.8 here. He hit 123 in the meet, or 122.5 in the meet. For squat, he tends to be a touch high as well with the estimated 1 RM. And that's the thing to know. Like, these numbers are not going to be perfect, like, oh, he's going to hit 192.5 in the meet. That is not what it means. You have to find trends of what these numbers actually mean come meet day. He was at 192.9 here. I believe he hit 182.5 in the meet, and he missed 187.5. So moving forward, if we're looking at squat, he's actually tracking in a pretty similar manner, and that's about what we expected. I think we're actually planning around 182.5 to 185 on meet day from looking at these numbers comparing to what we saw in the same block before. On bench, we can see he's tracking a little bit higher. He's tracking about 128. But one of the big things here is notice the 123 at 9 RPE versus 120 at 8.5. We're actually getting a bit closer to an actual 1 RM, so that's probably going to actually translate a little bit better. Based off of this numbers, I'm pretty confident he's going to be able to do 125 in a meet where he did 122.5 last time, even though we can kind of see here that last week here he trended up, but for the most part he's probably around about 126 here for like an estimated 1 RM, versus now he's trending more around that 128 on most parts, so about 2 kilos over, which would be 2 kilos more based off of meet, 125. And then we've got deadlift. He's trending around 242.5, and before he was 234 and he added 5 kilos. Okay, well, that's giving us a good idea that he's going to be able to be probably around like 245 to 247.5 based off of using the same data from the same block prior that was similar. So this is a way to use it as a testing tool. Obviously, we can use it as a test in the block of just, here's a 8 RPE single, let's see what you do. Or we can literally use it to establish estimated 1 RM patterns and be able to use that to establish ideas of past performance to current performance. All right, so moving on next to using RP or singles as an auto regulation tool. I'm going to show you a couple ways of how to do this, and some ways I used to do it versus how I now do it, because I've kind of seen some things. So this is actually the free program I have on my website from 2018. You're going to see here, I've actually had a lot of people message me about this. They messaged me thinking something screwed up. If someone could actually do this as prescribed, it would be great. But the issue is, and I'll kind of explain this in a second, most people don't like this. As you'll notice, like on squat, we've got a single every single week at 430, and that's programmed at 89.2%, which is about a 7 RPE. A fairly easy single that literally the entire point of it there is to auto-regulate the entirety of the week. Because what you'll see here is, let's say I rate that a 6.5 RPE in this space. You'll actually see, okay, it gives me a training max, and now these numbers and these numbers adjust and auto-regulate based off of that training max off of that single. And it's literally an auto-regulation tool. So if you go 7.5 here, you go 7 here, you go 7 here, and you go 6.5, and there's actual progression of strength throughout the block, it's going to regulate. You can see here as my estimated 1RM goes up, it's going to regulate the training for the entirety of the week. I'm not necessarily talking about like everyone needs to set up their program like this. I just using it as a description of like, this is very much using it as an auto-regulation tool. The issue is, most people don't like repeating the same weight over and over. I even showed that on Lorenzo's program where we were just using 7 RPE. A lot of people struggle with that, and they don't like the idea of repeating the same weight because it's just not as motivating. Like what actually happens sometimes with doing something like this program is that 430 actually almost gets worse, not because they're getting weaker, but because they stop amping themselves up for it or getting like motivated for it, because it's just the same weight I do every single week. So what tends to happen, and I think you see this with a lot of coaches, either advertently or inadvertently, is we see ramping with the sets throughout the week. So this is actually block 2 of that same program, and it's purposely done with, because this is actually getting more into not only auto-regulation, but now testing. But I would say more often than not, this is how I'm setting up singles nowadays, is that there is a ramping week to week where the weight is slightly going up in some manner, because otherwise people tend to lose motivation with the same weight. They want to see that weight going up. So this is not only an auto-regulation tool. You can rate this as 7. You can see it changes it. You can rate this as 7. Okay, it's definitely going to change that because that's actually more weighted as 7. Now this is a 7.5, it's going to auto-regulate, and this is a 7.5, it's going to auto-regulate. That's not only a testing tool, but also a auto-regulation tool where we can use that to gauge the rest of the training. So if you watch some of my other videos, you can kind of understand kind of how this is set up. I'm not going to go into the programming of like how this all calculates and whatnot, but you can just see how it's auto-regulating the training by using that weight. It's establishing an estimated 1RM, and then it's adjusting the rest of the weight. Now that's a little bit fancier way to do it because it's literally calculating it. Probably the more normal way is you have a top set at an RPE, let's say a 7 RPE, and it's supposed to be a 7. And let's say a 7 is 505 on the day. You insert that in, that gives you the weights for the rest of the week. That doesn't necessarily establish an estimated 1RM. It's just going to establish the top set at a 7, and then the rest of the weight then regulates off of that. That could be a top set though too. You could do a top set double and it regulates off of it, but a single obviously can use that as well. And as those singles ramp up, you can continue to regulate training based off of it, and it's going to regulate the training based off of where that single is. And the one other thing to notate here is we can regulate daily or weekly or even within a block based off of a single. It all just depends. Like in this first example, when you rate this number, it regulates the training for the entirety of the week based off of that single. There's no right and wrong here. It just depends on what you think is the best tool for you. Versus this day, it only regulates the weights for this day. And then I actually don't have it in here. I deleted it. But if you saw the entirety of the program, you would see that the other day is RPE and or percentage base. And that day is singular, where it's going to adjust based off of that day. But you can see here, obviously I have squat. I have bench in the same manner where he's going to do a top single. It's going to regulate for the day. And here, this lifter actually has ramping sets up to a single. He's going to insert that in, and then it's going to regulate for the back off. So it's actually percentage-based ramping sets into a single, then regulating the back off based off of that single. So just a lot of ways we can do that. That's probably something in some other videos I've kind of covered of kind of like how we can program RPE and stuff like that. But in the sense of singles, we can definitely use it as an auto-regulation tool, whether it's on the day, or it is regulating for the week. So next up, we've got building confidence. So this is a lifter who tended to really have high anxiety with singles, especially on squat. We knew based off of their rep work and everything else they did that they should be hitting a lot more. It's just whenever it came to singles time, it would be an issue. And one of my favorite things to do with these lifters is, like I said, they need to do singles. but we can do it in manners that tends to help them psychologically perform better with them. This lifter, I tried forever to put that single as that top set there, and it never went well. So all I did was I started doing a top set for reps, this set of 4, that then led into the single. Now, could that create a bit of fatigue leading to that single? Possibly, but I also knew this lifter had a decent work capacity to carry over strength, and I knew that they could do this. And I've seen this actually pretty often as well, that most people, especially on ascending sets, that's kind of talking about like the benefit of ascending sets. Dave Wilson actually did a really good video on that lately. I'd recommend looking at that, but ascending sets do a really good job of creating motivation through multiple sets ramping up. And you'll find a lot of people who are kind of high adrenaline lifters can all of a sudden do more sets at higher intensity because they treat those sets more important than just doing a top set and then just backing off from there. So coming back around, this lifter would do a top set of 4, and then that would actually, you can see here, it would give a plus 20, here's plus 25. It gives a certain number adding to their single, and they would actually do the single after. And really what would happen here, especially like week 4, this lifter hit 280. That was actually above their meet best at the time. Their meet best was 270. Even though I knew they could hit well over 270, their meet best was 270. This lifter then hit a set of 4 for 270 because every single time we did rep work, they were so much better with it, and they would literally rep out what they could do in competition. So this lifter hits a set of 4 at 270. In their head, they're like, okay, I've got 280. Well, no duh, I can do 280. I just did 270 for 4. There's absolutely no reason I can't do 80. And that's the psychological kind of manipulation there, is that you're doing this rep work 260 for 4, 250 for 4, with just a little bit of a bump leading into that single. And in their head, they're thinking, okay, well, if I can do this rep work, of course I can do this single. Like 260 for 4 wasn't even that hard. I can definitely do 275. If you flip that, you'd be amazed how many lifters who have this anxiety all of a sudden can't do that 275 single. They just do so much better having this set prior to build confidence with rep work that then basically instills in them like there should be absolutely no reason I fear 280 because I just did 270 for 4. And I've seen this work time and time again with these high anxiety lifters who kind of fear these heavier weights. And this is definitely my go-to when it comes to programming for this type of person, and introducing these singles and forcing them to do them, but in a way where they're gonna kind of trick themselves into not fearing them as much. So continuing on with the personalities, I've kind of mentioned that based off of personality type, we might have someone who can handle singles more year round because they're a bit more neutral and calm versus the high adrenaline lifter. And there's different ways we can do this. Either, and not only one, the frequency of how often they do singles, but also their ability to be able to do a single and then still come back and be able to hit another like top set and be super strong. Because I've had a lot of times, you may have heard people do this, you may have said this yourself, is you'll do a single, call it your top set, and then you have like a heavy triple, and you'll call that back off work. It is definitely not back off work. That is another top set. If anything, that triple is actually your real top set. And that's where people, this is kind of the framework. If people think that single was the set and then everything else should be easy after because it's back off work. And that's not the case. And that's like the case here. This lifter had a single followed by a top set of 2. And actually this lifter, I can tell you, she did 375. Whoops. She did 375 for a double. She hit a single and then she doubled it. Because the single, she would get a little bit hyped up for it, but she was very good at carrying intensity throughout all sets. She didn't have a big drop off. She was someone that I had no issue doing singles more often and programming a single and then a pretty darn heavy triple after, or double or triple or rep work after, because she's able to carry over that same strength to multiple sets and not have this kind of adrenaline dump and motivation dump. She uses that single for what it's there for. She's using it for skill practice. She's using it for testing. And in the sense of this, we were leading into nationals. And she was using this to drive up intensity and also get those adaptations that occur from that. So the opposite end is someone who might be a little bit more kind of high adrenaline. This could be high adrenaline / someone who fatigues very easy. Because actually this example, I actually already mentioned this person. This is someone who I said is a pretty strong lifter, big dude, got very disproportionately fatigued from that single. And so for that type of person and or someone who might be really high adrenaline and like they have this big drop off after their single, 1, we might not do them as frequently, but 2, what you'll see here is that single actually was their top set. Where with this other lifter, they had a single and then a top set of 2. This lifter had a single, and that was their top set, and then everything else was a back off from there. And you can actually see, like if I change this, it was regulating the back off work. So they had a single at 7, they inserted that in, and then everything backed off from that number. And as that drove up, they continued to do the same. So for this lifter, I did that for the reason that they disproportionately got fatigued from singles, but this might also be something that I do for someone who's really high adrenaline and that we know we need to do singles, lean, and meet. I'm probably going to make that their top set and not do another top set after. I'm going to back off from there, and that's going to be their main work for the day. But then maybe on the secondary day, I'm going to drive some type of rep work at a little bit higher intensity, knowing that we didn't do much rep work at higher intensity on their main day because that single had to take place of it, and pretty much most of their adrenaline and motivation and focus went into that on the day. And lastly here, what I want to cover is just some examples of people doing very high frequency singles, because we not only something I want to cover here that I didn't really talk about too much is we talked about like the implement at the frequency of singles in the sense of like a weekly basis. Like, do we do them year round? Do we just do them once a week? In the sense of like blocks leading into a meet. We can also think about the frequency of singles in a week though. Like we might do more than one. This lifter actually does 3 singles in the week on bench press and to pretty high intensity. You'll actually see as we kind of work into it, they're getting up to pretty darn high intensities. It's actually not letting me scroll all the way over here. But this lifter is doing a single on, this is a 5-day-a-week bencher. They're doing a single at a 7 RPE Tuesday. Pretty easy single on Thursday. This is just a skill single, and then they're doing their heaviest single on Saturday. This lifter does singles year round, and they do multiple singles in a week because they need it for that skill acquisition as well as the adaptations based on physiological and neurological. They need that higher intensity on a frequent basis to drive up that strength progression. We can also see that on deadlift too, though. I might also use this on deadlift. So this lifter has a single that we're driving up intensity, leading actually into a meet, and they've got their heaviest single here to 9 RPE. But then we actually have a single on their other day that's very light. But notice 6 RPE, 6 RPE, 6 RPE, 6 RPE, 6 RPE. This is simply a skill practice single, nothing else. I actually shouldn't say that. It is a skill practice single that also regulates the rest of the work. So if they do 230 every week, you'll actually see that the weight's gonna, well, it doesn't increase yet. It will eventually increase. There you go. It'll actually start to increase a little bit as they go along because that regulates the back off work. But more so, I could have just written the back off work in there. It would be completely fine. But more so, that single is in there for the skill practice. But we might introduce this of, okay, here is the single that we're progressing on intensity based for the actual adaptation. Here is the single within a weekly structure for the skill practice. So next up, we've got singles for squat. This is a lifter who's highly proficient. They do not get, they tend to take singles very well with very little fatigue. So we actually have a lot of skill practice here. We have a single on Tuesday. We have a very light tempo, 3 light tempo singles on Thursday, and then an easier single on Saturday. So again, it could be a whole video of me explaining the implementation of multiple singles in a week, but I just want to say that not only are we talking about the implementation of singles on a weekly basis and year round, we're also talking about how many are we doing in a week. So as I kind of talked about the who should be doing singles, if they are check marking every single one of those that they are very adept and are going to get a lot of benefit from doing singles, they might not only be doing them year round, they may be doing them multiple times in a week, or they might be doing them year round, but then come closer to competition, we are doing them even more frequently within the week. And then lastly here, one other option. So we've got this person's secondary day, program with rep work. Then we have on their tertiary day some very light singles for skill practice. This is someone that we just needed a little bit more skill practice with technique, so we're building up on light singles because typically come Saturday they're having a little bit of issue when it came to performing at these heavier weights. It wasn't a matter of strength, it was just feeling unpracticed. So we have these singles to be able to kind of hit these intensities of kind of like a last warm-up or near last warm-up weight leading into that Saturday, kind of give them the skill practice. This is not going to be very fatiguing, but it's leading into it. So just some examples here again of how we can do some higher frequency singles within a block and within a week to be able to not only satisfy one aspect, but satisfy multiple aspects of either skill practice or testing or auto-regulation all within the same week. So that's my all-encompassing guide into introducing heavy singles into your training and all the variables that need to come into play to account for the frequency and the implementation of them. So like I said, if you are looking for an excuse to do yearly singles and why that's going to be the best way to do it, this probably wasn't the video for you. I definitely bias more towards not doing them yearly and being a bit more strategic with the timing of them and rotating through other variations and rep schemes and goals within training. But within that, obviously, there are a lot of uses for singles, and there are some people that are going to greatly benefit from doing those year-round and throughout the entirety of their training. So it really just depends, and I hope from this video you're able to get a better idea of kind of where you fit in and what would be most beneficial for you. So if you have any questions, like always, feel free to comment down below. I try to answer every single one of them. If you like the video, make sure to actually like it and click that like button. If you're not subscribed, subscribe to the channel. Share this with some friends if you think it would be beneficial so we can get this information out there. And other than that, I will talk to you all later. Until next time, peace.